not take us! Engaging hostile! Attack!
The sky over the Wyoming basin did not burn when the 6th Dominion arrived. It merely bruised, a deep, unnatural purple bleeding into the gray belly of an impending winter storm. Commander Draxi stood at the vanguard of the drop pod. She was 7 feet of engineered perfection. Her skin was the pale, icy blue of a dying star clad in obsidian armor that bore the scratches of a dozen conquered worlds. She was the tip of the spear, the apex predator of an empire that spanned galaxies. She had spent 11 years studying the tactical readouts of this blue marble. She knew their weapon yields. She knew their population densities. She expected artillery. She expected the desperate, fiery resistance of a dying race. The pod doors hissed open. The ramp slammed down into the mud of the Shoshone National Forest. Silence. There were no sirens, no screaming jets, just the heavy, wet smell of decaying pine needles and the oppressive chill of the wind. Draxi signaled her elite vanguard forward. 400 of the Dominion's finest, armed with plasma rifles that could melt a tank into slag, fanned out into the dense, towering timber. They moved with absolute precision, ghostly shadows in the fading afternoon light. Then the forest pushed back. It did not start with a bang. It started with a low, guttural vibration that rattled the damp earth. From the shadow of a massive ancient redwood, it emerged. It was not a machine. It wore no armor. It was a mountain of brown muscle and coarse fur, smelling of rotting fish and wet earth. A grizzly bear. It stood on its hind legs, towering even over Draxi's heaviest shock troopers, and let out a sound that bypassed the soldiers' auditory receptors and vibrated directly against their spines. Draxi's tactical visor struggled to classify the threat. No weapons detected, no energy signature, just pure ancient malice. Her lead squad, veterans of the siege of Kalen Prime, broke. They did not retreat tactically. They ran. They scrambled backward through the mud, their plasma rifles forgotten, terrified of a creature that looked at them not as conquerors, but as a minor inconvenience. "Hold the line," Draxi barked into her comms. Her voice was sharp, a whip crack in the damp air. But the line was already disintegrating. A high-pitched whine filled the air. Millions of them, a black cloud rising from the marshland, mosquitoes. The Dominion's advanced kinetic shielding was designed to deflect railgun slugs moving at Mach 5. It was not designed to filter out microscopic biological entities moving at a crawl. The swarm descended. They found the micro-gaps in the armor joints. They found the air vents. Across the comms, Draxi heard something she had never heard in her centuries of command. Her soldiers were screaming, not in agony, but in a frantic, maddening misery. Elite warriors were dropping their weapons to slap at their own helmets, marching in disoriented circles, their strict formation dissolving into chaotic flailing. Draxi moved to intercept her breaking lines, her heavy boots sinking into the freezing mud. She was angry, a cold, furious burn in her chest. She pushed through the dense underbrush separating from her command unit to flank the retreating squad. That was her first mistake. The terrain of Wyoming does not forgive those who walk blindly into it. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in the span of 10 minutes. The bruised sky ripped open and the snow began to fall. Not a gentle dusting, but a blinding horizontal sheet of white. Draxi's thermal regulators whined in protest. Her visor iced over. She wiped it clear just in time to see the wall of muscles step into her path. It was a bull moose, 800 pounds of territorial aggression crowned with antlers that looked like jagged slabs of iron. It stood in the center of the narrow game trail, steam pluming from its nostrils. It did not care about the Dominion. It did not care about her rank. Draxi raised her plasma pistol. "Move, beast!" The moose charged. It was a collision of alien steel and terrestrial bone. The impact threw Draxi backward. Her armor absorbed the brunt of the kinetic force, but a jagged point of the antler caught the unprotected seam beneath her ribs. Pain, hot and blinding, flared through her side. She fired a warning shot into the dirt, the plasma turning the snow to instant steam. The moose snorted, shook its massive head, and trotted off into the blizzard, utterly indifferent to the weapon that could level a city block. Draxi lay in the snow. Her breathing was ragged. Blue blood seeped from the gap in her armor, instantly freezing against the metal. The cold was absolute. It was a living thing chewing through her thermal layers, sinking into her bones. Her comms were dead. Scrambled by the atmospheric interference of the storm, she forced herself to her feet. She was a commander. She would not die in the dirt of an unclassified mudball. She dragged herself forward, leaning heavily against the frozen trunks of the pines, leaving a faint trail of blue blood in the rising snowdrifts. Miles away at the edge of the tree line, Elias struck a match. The flame flared, illuminating a face weathered by 62 years of hard winds and hard truths. Deep lines etched the corners of his eyes. A jagged, faded scar ran down his left cheek. His hands, thick and calloused, held a metal bee smoker. His right hand trembled. It wasn't just the cold. The cold only woke the memory up. It was the tremble that always came when the snow started falling this thick. It was the phantom echo of a night 10 years ago. The night the latch on the barn door had jammed. The night he had hesitated for 3 seconds too long, trying to save the horses while his wife walked out into the whiteout to find him. 3 seconds of hesitation, a lifetime of empty chairs. Elias squeezed his hand into a fist until the joints popped, forcing the tremor down. He breathed in the smell of burning pine needles and burlap from the smoker, grounding himself. "Easy, girls," he muttered. His voice was like gravel rolling over felt. Quiet, deep. He puffed the sweet smoke over the top of the wooden hive boxes, calming the frantic hum inside. The bees were sealing themselves in for the freeze. They knew what was coming. Nature always gave a warning if a man was quiet enough to listen. He secured the last latch on the lid. The wind was howling now, a physical force pushing against his heavy canvas coat. He picked up his thermos and his crowbar. He always carried the iron bar to break the ice on the water troughs, and turned toward his cabin. A glow caught his eye. Down by the wire fence that separated his property from the federal forest. It was faint, a strange pulsing azure light half buried in a snowdrift. Elias didn't run. He walked with the heavy, deliberate strides of a man who had seen too many broken things in the dark to rush blindly toward them. The snow crunched beneath his insulated boots. As he got closer, the shape resolved. It was massive, taller than any man he had ever met, clad in dark metal that looked like beetle shells slick with ice, and it was bleeding, the blood glowing faintly blue against the white snow. Draxi was slumped against the wooden fence post. Her vision was tunneling. The cold had won. Her internal heaters had failed completely. She heard the crunch of footsteps. Through the haze of pain and hypothermia, she forced her head up. She expected an apex predator, a bear, a wolf. Instead, she saw a human, an older male. He was small compared to her fragile looking in his cloth garments. He held a curved piece of iron in one hand and a metal cylinder in the other. He had no energy weapons, no armor. Draxi tried to raise her plasma pistol. Her arm wouldn't obey. The muscles were frozen stiff. This was it. The great commander of the Dominion executed by a local primitive in a frozen wasteland. She braced for the killing blow. Elias stopped 3 feet away. He looked at the massive alien woman. He looked at the strange glowing blood. He looked at the gun slipping from her frozen fingers. He didn't raise the crowbar. He didn't shout. He didn't run for a shotgun. He took a slow sip from his thermos, the steam curling around his scarred cheek. He looked down at her. "You lost," he asked. The translation matrix in Draxi's ear crackled to life, delivering the words in her native tongue. The sheer absurdity of the question short-circuited her tactical reasoning. Lost, she was an invader. She was a conqueror. She tried to speak to declare the authority of the Dominion, but all that came out was a wet, rattling cough. Her eyes rolled back, and the massive alien collapsed face first into the snow. Elias sighed, a long, heavy breath that disappeared into the wind. He didn't know what she was. A government experiment from the base down south. A girl in a high-tech suit gone wrong. He didn't care. Out here, when the temperature dropped below zero, politics and origins didn't matter. Only the cold mattered, and the cold was a killer he refused to let win on his land again. He wedged his crowbar into his belt. He stepped over the plasma pistol, ignoring it entirely. He grabbed the heavy armored shoulder pads of the giant woman. "Come on, big girl," Elias grunted. He heaved. The weight was immense. It felt like trying to drag an engine block through mud. But Elias had spent 40 years bucking hay and pulling calves in the dead of night. His muscles were built on stubbornness. His boots found purchase in the snow. Inch by inch, he dragged the 7-foot commander of the alien fleet away from the fence across the frozen yard and toward the warm yellow light of his cabin. The wind screamed, trying to pull them back into the dark. Elias just pulled harder. Inside the cabin was a sanctuary of heat and wood smoke. It smelled of worn leather coffee and dried sage. The cast-iron stove in the corner radiated a fierce, steady warmth. Elias dragged her onto the braided rug near the fire. He didn't waste time marveling at the strange, smooth metal of her armor or the pale blue of her skin. He treated her like he would any creature pulled from a freeze. He needed to get the cold out. His hands steady now with a task to do found the release catches on her chest plate. The alien tech was complex, but mechanical logic is universal. He pressed twisted, and the heavy obsidian plating hissed, popping loose. He stripped away the upper armor, revealing a black, skin-tight undersuit that was torn at the ribs. The blue blood was sluggish, coagulating in the heat. Elias fetched a clean towel, a bowl of hot water, and his first aid kit from the bathroom. He knelt beside her. He wiped the freezing mud from her pale face. Her features were sharp, aristocratic, but drawn tight with pain. He cleaned the wound on her side. It was deep, a nasty gouge from the antler, but it hadn't hit anything vital. He packed it with good saws and bound it tight with medical tape. Then he grabbed the thick, heavy quilt from his own bed, the one his wife had sewn, and draped it over her massive frame, tucking the edges in to trap the heat. He stood up, his knees popping in the quiet room. He walked to the stove, threw in another log, and poured a fresh mug of coffee. He sat in the worn armchair across from her, and he waited. An hour passed. The storm outside raged, hammering against the heavy log walls of the cabin. Inside, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the ticking of an old grandfather clock. Draxie's eyes snapped open. Instinct drove her. She surged upward, a predatory strike, expecting to be in a containment cell, expecting restraints, expecting interrogators. She hit the floor hard, a sharp gasp tearing from her throat as the wound in her side pulled tight. Careful. The voice was a low rumble. Draxie's head snapped toward the sound. The old human male was sitting in a chair, a ceramic cup in his hand. He was not looking at her with fear. He was not holding a weapon. He was looking at her the way a mechanic looks at a damaged engine. Draxie instinctively reached for her sidearm. Her holster was empty. Her heavy armor was gone, neatly stacked by the door. She was wrapped in a soft, heavy textile that smelled faintly of flowers and dust. "Where is my gear?" she demanded. The translation matrix in her ear was still functioning, rendering her sharp alien consonants into perfect, unaccented English. Elias took a sip of his coffee. He pointed a calloused finger toward the door. "Over there. Figured you didn't need the metal shell to sleep." Draxie stared at him. Her tactical mind raced. Why was she alive? Why was she not restrained? "You have disarmed a superior officer," she lied smoothly, falling back on her training. "I am part of a classified atmospheric testing initiative. My unit will be looking for me." Elias looked at her blue skin. He looked at her 7-foot frame. He looked at the pool of glowing blue blood he had mopped up with a shop rag. He set his coffee mug down on the side table. "Atmospheric testing," Elias repeated. His voice was completely flat. "Yes," Draxie said, lifting her chin, trying to summon the imposing aura of a commander while sitting on a rug wrapped in a quilt. "It is highly classified." Elias leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. His eyes, pale blue and sharp as shattered ice, locked onto hers. There was a depth of sorrow in those eyes, a quiet exhaustion that made Draxie suddenly feel very young despite her centuries. "Lady," Elias said softly, "I'm a beekeeper, not an idiot." Draxie tensed, her muscles coiled. If she had to kill him with her bare hands to maintain operational security, she would. She shifted her weight, preparing to strike. Elias saw the shift. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for the heavy iron fireplace poker inches from his foot. Instead, he reached down to the floor beside his chair. He picked up a ceramic bowl. Steam rose from it, carrying the rich, savory smell of beef carrots and thyme. He held it out to her. "You're blue. You bleed glow in the dark. And you got your ribs rearranged by a moose." Elias said, his tone utterly devoid of judgment. "Whoever you are, wherever you're from, Out there, the wind is blowing 40 miles an hour and the temperature is -10. You step out that door, right now, you die, classified or not. He extended the bowl an inch further. Eat the stew, get your strength back. You can conquer whatever you're trying to conquer tomorrow. Draxi looked at the bowl. Then she looked at the man. In all her years traversing the stars, bringing worlds to their knees, she had seen terror. She had seen defiance. She had seen groveling submission. She had never seen kindness. Not like this. Blunt, unassuming, asked for nothing in return. Her stomach growled a traitorous rumble in the quiet room. Her body demanded calories to fuel the healing process. Slowly, warily, she reached out. Her massive blue-skinned hand dwarfed the ceramic bowl. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. His skin was rough like sandpaper, but it was warm. Draxi took the bowl. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. She looked down at the steaming liquid, the strange, earthy smell filling her senses. She took a slow sip. It was hot, rich. It tasted like survival. Elias picked up his coffee again. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes moving to the window, watching the snow hurl itself against the glass. "Storm's gonna last all night," he said quietly. Draxi did not reply. She sat on the floor of an alien cabin wrapped in a dead woman's quilt, eating stew made by a man she had been sent to annihilate. And for the first time in her long, violent life, Commander Draxi of the 6th Dominion did not know what to do next. Morning broke over the Wyoming basin like a shattered pane of glass. Cold, sharp, unforgiving. The blizzard had blown itself out overnight, leaving behind a world buried in 3 feet of silent, blinding white. Draxi woke on the braided rug. The fire in the cast-iron stove had burned down to glowing orange embers. She sat up slowly. The wound in her side pulled a dull ache instead of a blinding fire. Her accelerated cellular regeneration was working. Her thermal core was stabilizing. She was alive. She looked around the empty cabin. The human was gone. She found her undersuit draped over a wooden chair. Her heavy armor was stacked neatly by the door. Her plasma pistol sat on the kitchen table, completely ignored. It was an insult to Dominion protocol. You do not leave a loaded weapon near an enemy combatant. But then the man with the scarred face had not treated her like a combatant. He had treated her like a stray dog caught in the freeze. Draxi dressed. The air in the cabin was warm, but the moment she pushed the heavy oak door open, the terrestrial cold slapped her across the face. It stole the breath from her lungs. The sky was an impossible piercing blue. Down by the tree line, she saw him. Elias was chest-deep in a snowdrift. He held a pair of heavy iron bolt cutters in a spool of thick barbed wire. He was trying to repair the section of the fence the bull moose had splintered to matchwood the day before. Draxi watched him from the porch. The man was struggling. The thick leather gloves he wore were clumsy, but when he took them off to thread the wire, his bare hands trembled violently in the sub-zero air. He fumbled the heavy iron staple. It dropped into the snow. He cursed quietly, a puff of white steam escaping his lips, and knelt to dig it out with freezing fingers. In the Dominion, weakness was a death sentence. You did not struggle. You either conquered the task or the task consumed you. Draxi stepped off the porch. Her heavy boots crunched through the crust of the snow. She did not feel the cold the same way he did not anymore. Her body had adapted to the baseline temperature. She walked the 50 yards to the fence line in silence. Elias did not look up until her massive shadow fell over him. He paused, his breath pluming in the air. He looked at her tall, blue-skin frame standing in the middle of a frozen Wyoming ranch, as casually as if she belonged there. "You should be inside," Elias rasped. "Wind chill will strip the skin right off you." Draxi looked at his hands. They were raw, the knuckles cracked and bleeding. She reached into the utility pouch on her thigh. She pulled out a small metallic cylinder no larger than a cigar, a localized plasma welder. She stepped past him, her massive shoulder brushing against his heavy canvas coat. She took the 2 severed ends of the heavy-gauge steel wire in her bare left hand. She pulled them together with terrifying ease, muscles bunching under her pale blue skin. With her right hand, she thumbed the activator on the cylinder. A brilliant, blinding spark of white-hot energy hissed in the morning air. 3 seconds. That was all it took. The 2 ends of the steel wire were fused flawlessly, stronger than the original metal. The air smelled sharply of ozone and scorched frost. Draxi released the wire. She clipped the cylinder back to her belt. She turned to look at him, expecting the awe, the fear, the realization of the technological supremacy she wielded. Elias looked at the fused wire. He looked at the tiny cylinder on her belt. Then he looked up at her face. "Well," Elias said softly, "that saves me an hour of freezing to death. Much obliged." He picked up his dropped bolt cutters, tapped the snow off them against his boot, and began walking toward the small cluster of wooden boxes near the edge of the property. Draxi frowned, her brow furrowed. Obliged. The translation matrix fed her the concept of gratitude, not fear, not submission, gratitude. She followed him, her long strides easily keeping pace with his heavy steps. "What are those?" she asked, her voice tight metallic. "Hives," Elias said. He didn't look back. "Checking the insulation. Cold snap like this can kill a colony overnight if the draft gets in." He stopped in front of the snow-capped wooden boxes. He didn't put on a protective suit. He didn't even put his gloves back on. He just stood there, breathing out a long, slow sigh. He reached down and gently pried the wooden lid off the top box. A low, vibrating hum rose into the air. Draxi tensed. Her combat instincts flared. The sound was too similar to the drone of a Dominion attack swarm. Her hand twitched toward where her sidearm should have been. Her breathing grew shallow, rapid. She took a heavy step backward, the snow crunching loudly under her boot. The hum inside the box changed. It grew sharper, angry. A dozen golden brown insects rose from the wooden frames, swirling in the freezing air. "Hold still," Elias commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Draxi froze. "They read the air," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, soothing murmur. "They read your heart rate. They read the tension in your muscles. You stand there wound up like a coiled spring and they think you're a threat. And if they think you're a threat, they will die trying to push you out." One of the bees landed on the back of Draxi's massive blue hand. She stared at it, a tiny, fragile thing of fuzz and translucent wings. It was nothing. She could crush 1,000 of them without feeling it, yet it carried a stinger. It was willing to destroy itself to defend its home. "Don't fight it," Elias whispered. He was looking at her, not the bees. "For once in your life, giant, just breathe. Let the world be." Draxi had spent 300 years fighting for rank, fighting for planets, fighting to maintain the iron grip of the Dominion. She did not know how to let the world be, but she looked at the old man. She saw the absolute stillness in his posture, the quiet acceptance of the harsh world around him. She closed her eyes. She forced her artificial lungs to expand slowly. She let the tension drain from her shoulders. She slowed her dual-core heart rate, mimicking the steady rhythmic pulse of the man standing beside her. The silence of the Wyoming winter washed over her. It was not the empty, terrifying vacuum of space. It was a heavy, living silence. The sound of the wind through the pines. The distant crack of ice settling on a frozen lake. The steady, thrumming heartbeat of the earth beneath the snow. The bee on her hand stopped buzzing. It crawled an inch across her pale blue skin, decided she was nothing more than a very strange, very cold tree, and took flight, returning to the warmth of the wooden box. Elias gently placed the lid back on the hive. He looked at Draxi. "See," he said, "not everything out here wants to kill you. You just have to stop giving them a reason to." He turned and walked back toward the cabin. Draxi stood alone in the snow for a long time, looking at her empty hand. By mid-afternoon, the sun had turned the surface of the snow into a blinding expanse of diamonds. Draxi had taken it upon herself to gather firewood. It was a tactical necessity. Fuel meant heat. Heat meant survival. She was at the edge of the tree line, carrying a fallen pine trunk on her shoulder that would have required 3 human men to lift. She moved with mechanical efficiency. Then her peripheral vision caught movement, a shadow darting behind a snow-draped boulder. Draxi stopped. She dropped the massive log. It hit the ground with a thunderous thud, shaking the snow from the branches above. She dropped into a combat stance, her eyes scanning the tree line. Another shadow moved to her left, then one to her right, a flanking maneuver. She waited for the strike. She waited for the plasma fire, the roar of an engine, the battle cry of a local militia. Instead, a creature stepped out from behind a frozen sagebrush. It was small, scruffy. Its fur was a mix of gray and rust matted with snow. It weighed perhaps 40 pounds. A coyote. It looked at her. It opened its mouth, panting, its tongue lolling out sideways. It did not look intimidating. It looked ridiculous. Draxi relaxed her stance slightly. "Go away, scavenger," she ordered in English. The coyote did not go away. It took 3 steps to the left. Another coyote stepped out from the trees to her right, then another behind her. There were 4 of them. Draxi turned, intending to walk back to the cabin. The moment she moved, the coyote behind her darted forward, snapping its jaws at the air inches from her boot, then immediately bounding backward out of reach. Draxi spun around, snarling. The coyote to her left moved up, cutting off her path to the cabin. "Do you want to die?" Draxi roared, stepping toward the animal. The coyote simply trotted backward, keeping a precise, calculated distance. When Draxi stopped, the coyote stopped. When she turned back toward the cabin, the one behind her darted in again. They were not attacking her. They were hurting her. They were treating the commander of the 6th Dominion like a stray sheep. Draxi's patience snapped. She let out a furious battle cry that echoed off the mountains, a sound that had made entire planetary garrisons surrender. She lunged at the lead coyote, intending to grab the beast by its scruff and hurl it into the trees. She planted her heavy boot to launch herself forward. But Wyoming is a treacherous host. Beneath the pristine layer of snow lay a slick, frozen sheet of mud from the creek bed. Draxi's boot hit the ice. All 7 feet and 400 pounds of alien muscle and bone went entirely airborne. Her legs flew up. The horizon tilted violently. She hit the ground flat on her back with an impact that knocked the breath from her lungs in a massive puff of vapor. She slid 3 feet through the snow and came to a halt waist-deep in a freezing, muddy puddle. Silence descended on the clearing. Draxi lay there staring up at the blinding blue sky. Her blue skin was plastered with brown mud. She looked slowly to her right. The 4 coyotes were sitting in a neat row at the edge of the trees. They were panting. Their mouths were pulled back. If Draxi didn't know better, she would have sworn the primitive beasts were smiling at her. From the porch of the cabin, a sound cut through the cold air. It started low, a strange rusty sound like an old engine trying to turn over after years of neglect. Draxi sat up in the mud, her eyes flashing with fury, and looked toward the cabin. Elias was leaning against the wooden railing. He had a mug of coffee in one hand. His shoulders were shaking. He threw his head back, and the sound broke loose. It was a laugh, a deep, booming, chest-rattling laugh that echoed across the valley. It was the sound of a man who had forgotten how to make that noise, finally remembering. He laughed until he had to put his coffee down on the rail. He laughed until he had to wipe a tear from his scarred cheek. Draxi felt a flush of absolute humiliating rage. She was a god of war. She commanded star destroyers. She did not provide entertainment for dirt farming primitives. She opened her mouth to threaten him, to promise him that his world would burn for this indignity. But she looked at Elias. The heavy, suffocating sorrow that always seemed to hang around his shoulders was gone. Just for a moment, he looked lighter. He looked alive. Then she looked back at the coyotes. They were still sitting there, intensely proud of their tactical victory over the giant blue alien. The absurdity of it struck her. The absolute, unhinged lunacy of this planet. They had weapons that could crack continents, but they were defeated by a bear. They had armor that could withstand a supernova, but they were routed by mosquitoes. And now the commander of the fleet was sitting in a mud puddle because of a dog. A sound escaped Draxi's throat, a sharp barking exhale. She covered her mouth with her muddy hand, but another sound followed, a low, rhythmic shaking in her chest. She was laughing. She didn't know how to do it. It felt strange, alien, pulling at the muscles in her face and chest. But it poured out of her, a deep, resonant, alien laugh that mixed with the old man's rusty roar. For 2 minutes, the clearing was filled with the sound of 2 beings from entirely different universes sitting in the freezing cold, laughing at the sheer ridiculous nature of existence. That night, the temperature plummeted again. The wind returned, howling down from the peaks, throwing handfuls of ice against the cabin windows like gravel. Inside, the fire roared. Elias was sitting in his armchair. Draxi was sitting on the braided rug, her back resting against the stone hearth. The mud had been washed away. She was wearing one of Elias's oversized flannel shirts over her black undersuit. It was absurdly tight across her broad shoulders, but it was warm. The silence between them was no longer tense. It was comfortable, a shared space carved out of the storm. Elias stood up to pour more coffee. He reached for the heavy iron kettle on top of the stove. At that exact moment, a massive gust of wind slammed into the cabin. The heavy timbers groaned in protest. Outside, a dead pine branch snapped with a crack like a rifle shot. Elias flinched. It wasn't a small flinch. His entire body jerked. His right hand, reaching for the kettle, spasmed violently. His fingers locked. His elbow jerked upward. His ceramic coffee mug slipped from his left hand. It hit the stone hearth and shattered into a dozen pieces, sending hot black liquid splashing across the stones and onto the toe of his boot. Elias froze. He didn't move to clean it up. He just stood there staring down at his right hand. The hand was trembling. Not a fine shiver from the cold. It was a violent, uncontrollable tremor. His jaw clenched so tight the muscles bulged beneath his scarred cheek. He looked suddenly very old, very fragile. Draxi shifted her weight, preparing to stand up and assist him. "Don't!" Elias rasped. The word was choked, forced through gritted teeth. He slowly lowered his shaking hand to his side. He took a deep, ragged breath. He knelt down, ignoring the heat of the stones, and began picking up the jagged pieces of ceramic with his bare left hand. Draxi watched him. "Your neurological pathways are misfiring. Is it a symptom of the atmospheric pressure?" Elias threw the broken ceramic into a tin bucket. He grabbed a rag and wiped up the coffee. He didn't look at her. He walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. He stared into the fire. The flames reflected in his pale eyes, making them look hollow. 3 seconds, Elias said quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy and jagged. Draxi did not interrupt. She remained perfectly still. 10 years ago, first week of December, Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth it had held earlier that afternoon. Storm blew in, worse than this one. A whiteout. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. He rubbed his scarred cheek slowly. I was out in the barn. Latch on the main door was frozen shut. The horses were panicking. I was trying to pry the iron loose. My hands were freezing. I was stubborn. I thought I could break it free. He paused. The silence in the cabin felt heavier than the storm outside. Sarah, my wife, she was up in the cabin. She saw I was taking too long. She grabbed a lantern. She came out to help me. Elias closed his eyes. I heard the hinges on the cabin door scream over the wind. I knew she was coming out. I should have let go of the latch. I should have turned around and walked toward the light. Met her halfway. His trembling right hand clenched into a tight fist, the knuckles turning white. I hesitated. I thought, just one more pull. Just 3 more seconds. If I can just get this latch, the horses will be safe. 3 seconds of hesitation. He opened his eyes. They were wet, but he didn't cry. He just stared at the fire with the look of a man who had watched his own soul burn to ash. The wind shifted. A whiteout gust hit, blew her lantern out. In 3 seconds, the snow swallowed her completely. She lost her bearing, spun around in the dark. I finally broke the latch. I turned around. The light was gone. I screamed her name for 6 hours, wandered in the dark until my own blood started freezing. Elias swallowed hard. The sound was audible in the quiet room. Found her the next morning, not 50 yards from the porch. She had frozen to death, trying to find her way back to a door she couldn't see. He looked at his right hand. The tremor was finally subsiding, leaving behind a dull, heavy stillness. That's why my hands shake when the ice hits, Elias whispered. And that's why I don't leave broken things in the snow anymore. Not even blue giants with guns. Draxi sat paralyzed. In the Dominion, death was a statistic, a calculation of acceptable losses, a glorious end in service to the Empire. She had ordered orbital bombardments that had erased millions of souls in the blink of an eye. She had never lost a moment of sleep. But looking at the broken man in the armchair, listening to the agonizing weight of 3 seconds of hesitation, Draxi felt a coldness in her chest that had nothing to do with the Wyoming winter. He hadn't saved her because she was valuable. He hadn't saved her for a reward. He had saved her because he was trying desperately to balance a scale in his soul that could never be balanced. She looked at his hands. The knuckles were raw, split, and bleeding slightly from the cold wind earlier, and the sharp edges of the broken mug. He was neglecting his own physical vessel to punish himself. Draxi stood up. She walked over to the small wooden table near the kitchen. She picked up the small, circular tin she had seen him use the day before, the beeswax salve. She walked back to the fireplace and knelt directly in front of his chair. Elias looked down at her, confused. Draxi reached out and took his right hand. The contrast was staggering. Her hand was massive, pale blue, smooth, and engineered for destruction. His hand was small, tan, scarred, and trembling. She popped the lid off the tin. She scooped out a small amount of the thick, yellow wax. It smelled of summer, of sunlight, and wildflowers. With surprising gentleness, the commander of the Sixth Dominion began to rub the beeswax into the cracked, bleeding knuckles of the human farmer. Elias stiffened. "You don't have to do that." "Be still," Draxi said quietly. She worked the wax into the skin. The heat of her alien body melted the salve, pushing it deep into the cracks. Her touch was methodical, careful. She didn't speak. She just focused on repairing the damage. Elias looked at the top of her dark alien head. The tension slowly drained out of his shoulders. The trembling in his hand finally completely stopped. The warmth of the fire wrapped around them. For the first time in 10 years, Elias did not feel entirely alone in the cabin. And for the first time in 300 years, Draxi felt like she was building something instead of tearing it down. She looked up, her piercing eyes meeting his tired ones. "Your world is harsh, Elias," she said, her voice softer than it had ever been. Elias looked at his repaired hand resting in hers. "It's honest," he replied softly. They stayed like that until the fire burned down to ash. The next morning broke clear and devastatingly bright. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine, untouched world. Draxi was at the stove, watching Elias cook thick slices of bacon in a cast-iron skillet. The smell filled the cabin, rich and heavy. She found herself actually anticipating the primitive nourishment. Then a heavy thumping sound echoed from the front porch. Someone knocking the snow off their boots. Elias reached for a towel. "That'll be Tommy, kid from the next property over. His dad plows the county road, probably bringing the mail." Draxi took a step backward into the shadows near the bedroom door. Her combat instincts instantly overrode the domestic peace of the morning, a civilian variable. Elias opened the door. A small human stood there. He was perhaps 8 planetary years old. He was wrapped in so many layers of neon-colored winter clothing that his arms stuck out stiffly from his sides. He looked like a heavily padded sphere with a face. "Mornin', Mr. Elias," the boy piped up, his breath pluming. He held out a brown paper bag. "Dad says the main road is clear down to the junction. Mom sent some extra coffee in the mail." "Thank you, Tommy. Tell your folks I appreciate it," Elias said, taking the bag. "You want to come in and get warm by the fire for a minute?" Tommy waddled into the cabin. He started to unzip his heavy coat. Then he stopped, his eyes wide and round beneath his wool hat locked onto the shadows near the bedroom. Draxi stood completely still. She was 7 feet tall, bright blue, and staring down at the child. In a Dominion pacification protocol, children were the most unpredictable variables. They screamed, they ran, they triggered panic cascades in the adult population. She braced herself for the shrieking alarm. Tommy stared at her. He blinked twice. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He tilted his head. "Wow," Tommy said. "You're really tall." He looked at Elias. "Is she a basketball player, Mr. Elias?" Draxi felt a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. "A basketball player," she repeated, looking at Elias for translation. Elias rubbed his chin to hide a smile. "Something like that, Tommy. She's visiting." Tommy nodded, accepting this monumental lie with the casual indifference only a child possesses. He pulled off his thick, wet mittens and dropped them by the door right next to the neat pile of Draxi's discarded black obsidian armor. "I dropped my toy in the snow," Tommy announced, bending down to retrieve one of his mittens. As his small, clumsy hand reached down, his fingers brushed against the utility belt attached to Draxi's armor plating. He knocked a small metallic square loose. It clattered against the wooden floorboards. Draxi's blood ran cold. It was her long-range subspace communicator. She had disabled it when she was bleeding out in the snow to prevent the enemy from tracking the signal. The impact on the floor jarred the internal casing. A single piercing red light illuminated on the face of the metal square. A harsh metallic voice shattered the quiet warmth of the cabin. It spoke in the sharp, guttural clicks in consonants of the Dominion High Command. But Draxi's translation matrix was still active in her ear. and the volume was loud enough that the English translation bled through the earpiece, echoing clearly in the small room. Commander Draxi, biometrics acquired, signal locked. Fleet is in low orbit standby. Elias froze. He turned his head slowly. He looked at the device on the floor. The metallic voice continued, devoid of any emotion, delivering the promise of absolute annihilation. Orbital bombardment of grid sector 47 awaiting your mark. All ground forces ready to purge the planet. Awaiting your command to burn, Commander. The red light pulsed, a heartbeat of death in the quiet cabin. Tommy looked at the device. "That's a weird radio," he said. Elias didn't look at the radio. He didn't look at Tommy. He slowly, deliberately turned his gaze to the giant blue-skinned woman standing in the shadows. The woman whose hands were still soft with the beeswax he had made. The woman who had laughed with him in the mud. His pale eyes were no longer warm. They were as cold and hard as the ice outside the door. Draxi stared back at him. For the first time in her centuries of existence, the commander of the Sixth Dominion felt the terrifying, paralyzing grip of true fear. The red light on the communicator pulsed, a mechanical heartbeat echoing in the dead silence of the cabin. Tommy stood frozen by the door, his oversized winter coat making him look like a brightly colored statue. He looked from the metal box on the floor to Elias, waiting for the adult to make sense of the harsh alien syllables that had just promised the burning of the world. Elias did not look at the boy. He did not look at the radio. His pale, ice-blue eyes were locked onto the giant woman standing in the shadows of his home. The silence stretched. It was not the comfortable shared silence of the morning. It was a vacuum. It sucked the oxygen from the room. It suffocated the warmth of the wood stove. Elias finally moved. He walked slowly to the door. He picked up the boy's dropped mitten and handed it to him. His hands were perfectly steady. The tremor was gone, replaced by a terrifying, absolute rigidity. "Tommy," Elias said. His voice was unrecognizable. It was not the gentle rumble of a neighbor. It was the flat, dead tone of a man standing on the edge of a frozen grave. "Go home. Do not stop to play in the drifts. Go straight to your father." The boy, sensing the sudden, crushing shift in the atmosphere, didn't argue. He grabbed the paper bag, shoved his hand into the wet mitten, and bolted out the door. The heavy oak slammed shut behind him. The latch clicked, a sharp, final sound. Elias turned around. He walked to the kitchen table. He did not reach for his hunting rifle above the mantel. He reached down and picked up the heavy iron crowbar whilst resting against the firewood box. The metal was cold. He gripped it until his knuckles turned entirely white. Draxi stepped out of the shadows. The oversized flannel shirt suddenly looked ridiculous on her, a cruel mockery of domesticity draping the frame of a destroyer. She opened her mouth to speak, to issue an order, to explain, to do anything to bridge the sudden infinite chasm that had ripped open between the braided rug and the kitchen table. Elias spoke first. "Commander," he said. The word hit her like a kinetic slug. It stripped away the last 24 hours. It stripped away the shared laughter in the mud. It stripped away the warmth of the beeswax on cracked knuckles. He didn't ask if it was true. He didn't ask why she had lied. Out here, a man's actions were his truth. Her radio had spoken hers. "Elias, I can halt the sequence," Draxi said. Her voice, usually a booming instrument of command, felt thin, brittle. "The fleet is waiting on my biometric confirmation. I just need to reach the device." She took a step toward the radio on the floor. Elias raised the iron crowbar. He didn't point it at her like a weapon. He just held it across his chest, a barrier of cold iron between his world and hers. "You stepped toward that machine, and one of us is going to die on this floor," Elias said quietly. "And I have been ready to go for 10 years. Are you—" Draxi stopped. She looked at the old man. He was 62 years old. His heart beat too slowly. His joints ached with the dampness of the snow. She could cross the room and snap his neck before his brain registered the movement. But she looked at his eyes. There was no fear in them. None. Just a profound, crushing exhaustion. And beneath that exhaustion, a quiet, terrifying resolve. He was a man who had lost everything that mattered to him in a blizzard 10 years ago. He had nothing left to protect but the dirt he stood on and the bees in their wooden boxes. He would fight her. He would let her tear him apart just to buy his planet 3 more seconds of time. 3 seconds. Draxi felt a sickness rise in her throat. It was a new sensation. Guilt. It tasted like ash. Before she could step back, the light in the cabin vanished. It wasn't a cloud passing over the sun. The entire basin went dark. The brilliant, blinding reflection of the Wyoming snow was snuffed out like a crushed candle. A low, subsonic vibration rattled the floorboards. The ceramic mugs on the table began to shake. The heavy cast-iron skillet vibrated against the stovetop. The sound was too deep for the human ear to fully process, but Elias felt it in his teeth. It was the sound of atmospheric displacement on a massive scale. Elias moved to the window. Hanging in the sky above the Shoshone National Forest, blocking out the sun, was a nightmare of dark metal and pulsing energy. The flagship of the Sixth Dominion. It was 3 miles long and an angular wedge of obsidian armor that dwarfed the mountain peaks. Beneath it, a dozen smaller dropships were detaching, plummeting toward the earth like iron rain. The invasion had not been canceled. It had merely been waiting for its commander to be found. Droxy walked to the window and stood behind him. The blue light from the ships reflected off the glass, painting Elias's scarred face in ghostly hues. "My vanguard," Droxy whispered, the biometric pulse from the radio. "They tracked my exact coordinates. They think I am being held captive." Elias watched the dropships fire their retro thrusters, scorching the pristine snow of his lower pasture into black glass. "They're burning my fences," Elias said. That was all he said. He turned away from the window. He walked to the front door. He didn't put his coat on. He didn't grab his gloves. He just gripped the crowbar and reached for the latch. "Elias, stop," Droxy commanded. The authority returned to her voice, driven by sudden, desperate panic. "You walk out there, my soldiers will turn you into vapor. You do not understand what they are." Elias looked back at her over his shoulder. "I know exactly what they are," Elias rasped. "They're trespassers." He threw the door open. The freezing air rushed in, carrying the harsh chemical stench of burning ozone and scorched earth. Elias stepped out onto the porch. Droxy stared at the open doorway. The flannel shirt felt like chains around her chest. She looked down at her hands. The knuckles were still coated in the faint yellow sheen of the beeswax. She closed her eyes. The commander of the Sixth Dominion died in that moment. What opened its eyes was something entirely different. She moved to the corner of the room. She stripped off the human shirt. She lifted her heavy scarred obsidian armor. She strapped the breastplate over her ribs, ignoring the sharp spike of pain from the moose wound. She locked the gauntlets onto her wrists. She picked up her plasma pistol from the kitchen table. She walked out the door. The front yard of the cabin was gone. The snow had been flash melted into a steaming crater of mud and exposed bedrock. A massive dropship, jagged and terrifying, sat in the center of the ruin. Surrounding the porch were 50 Dominion shock troopers. They wore heavy assault armor, their faces hidden behind featureless glowing visors. Their kinetic rifles were raised 50 barrels glowing with lethal, superheated plasma, all aimed directly at the lone gray-haired man standing on the wooden steps. Elias stood with his feet planted, shoulder-width apart. The wind whipped his thin gray hair around his face. He held the crowbar resting casually against his right leg. He did not shake. He did not back down. He looked at the 50 alien rifles the same way he had looked at the broken fence that morning. A chore that needed dealing with. A figure stepped forward from the ranks of the soldiers. He was slightly shorter than Droxy, his armor adorned with the silver slash of a lieutenant. Vale, a brutal, efficient killer who had burned 3-star systems under Droxy's command. Vale looked at the old man. His translation matrix broadcasted his voice, a sneering metallic rasp that echoed across the valley. "Native biological," Vale commanded. "Drop the primitive implement. Fall to your knees. Press your face into the mud. You are in the presence of the Sixth Dominion." Elias spat into the steaming mud at the base of the stairs. "You're standing on my winter wheat, son." Elias said softly, "Get off my property." Vale let out a harsh bark of static that translated as a laugh. He raised his own plasma pistol, aiming it directly at Elias's chest. "Defiance," Vale said. "A common error. You will be the first example." Vale's finger tightened on the firing mechanism. The air around the barrel warped with heat. A shadow fell over the porch. Droxy stepped out of the doorway. She moved faster than human eyes could track. She stepped off the porch and placed her massive armored body directly between the glowing barrel of the lieutenant's gun and the old man in the canvas coat. Vale flinched instinctively, lowering his weapon. The 50 shock troopers snapped to attention, their boots slamming into the mud in perfect, terrified unison. Commander Vale gasped. He slammed his fist against his breastplate in a rigid salute. "We tracked your emergency beacon. We assumed the indigenous population had ambushed you. Orders are to sterilize the sector and extract you." Draxi stood tall. The wind caught the edges of her dark armor. She looked down at Vale. Her eyes, usually burning with the cold fire of conquest, were dark, immovable. "Lower your weapons," Draxi ordered. Vale hesitated. He looked past her broad shoulders to the old man on the porch who still had not dropped the iron bar. Commander Vale protested carefully. "Protocol dictates that all armed natives in the landing zone be pacified. He refuses to submit." Draxi took one slow, deliberate step forward. The mud hissed under her boots. She towered over her lieutenant. "I did not ask for a recitation of protocol, Vale," Draxi said. Her voice did not shout. It did not need to. It carried the absolute crushing weight of a collapsing star. "I gave you an order. Lower your weapons. Now." 50 plasma rifles dropped toward the mud. Vale holstered his pistol, his visor flashing nervously. Draxi turned her head. She looked back at Elias. Elias was looking at her back. He saw the scars on her armor. He saw the rigid military posture. But for the first time since the ships arrived, the coldness in his eyes flickered. He saw the way she had stepped in front of the gun without a microsecond of hesitation. She hadn't shielded him with her authority. She had shielded him with her body. "I see you," Elias whispered. The wind stole the words before they could reach her ears, but Draxi saw the movement of his lips. She saw the slight lowering of the crowbar. He understood. She was a prisoner just like him. He was trapped by a ghost in a blizzard 10 years ago. She was trapped by the blood of 1 billion souls on her hands and an empire that demanded more. They were two isolated creatures standing in a frozen wasteland, entirely alone among a crowd of soldiers. Draxi turned back to her lieutenant. She tapped the communication relay on her wrist. It synced with the massive flagship hovering in the atmosphere above them, opening a direct broadcast channel to the Dominion High Council light years away. "This is Commander Draxi," her voice boomed, amplified by the drop ship's external speakers echoing off the Wyoming mountains. The soldiers stood rigidly at attention, awaiting the order to begin the slaughter. "Planetary assessment complete," Draxi said. Her voice was steady, cold, flawless. "The invasion is aborted." Vale's head snapped up. The shock troopers shifted nervously. Murmurs of confusion buzzed across their internal comms. Aborted. The 6th Dominion did not abort. "The intelligence reports were fundamentally flawed." Draxi continued, her voice projecting to the stars. "The local fauna possesses a biomechanical resistance to our weaponry. The apex predators do not engage. They simply endure our fire. Microbiological swarms render our kinetic shielding useless. The planetary weather patterns are actively hostile, capable of freezing our engine blocks in minutes." She paused. She looked at the smoldering crater in the yard. She looked at the pine trees. Then she looked back at Elias. "But the primary threat is the indigenous population," Draxi broadcasted. "They exhibit a catastrophic psychological defect. They do not possess a recognized fear response to overwhelming military superiority." She pointed a gauntleted finger at Elias. "This specimen is unarmed. He is physically fragile. His lifespan is a fraction of ours. Yet when faced with an orbital armada and a vanguard of elite shock troopers, his heart rate did not elevate. He did not retreat. He demanded we vacate his agricultural territory. A species that cannot be intimidated cannot be conquered. They will fight until the dirt is soaked in blood, and then they will fight us with the dirt." Draxi lowered her hand. "To engage in a ground war here is to feed the Dominion fleet into a meat grinder of ice and madness. Planet Earth is reclassified. Code Black. Indefinite quarantine. Mark it on all navigation charts as a hostile death world." She cut the transmission. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Vale stared at her. He knew she was lying. He had seen the fragile wooden buildings on their descent. He knew their orbital cannons could turn this entire landmass to glass in 3 hours. But he also knew that Commander Draxi had never retreated from a battle in her life. If she said the planet was a death trap, the High Command would believe her. And questioning her out loud usually resulted in being thrown out of an airlock. Commander Vale finally said, his voice tight. Orders understood. We will begin immediate extraction. The fleet will jump to hyperspace on your mark. Initiate recall yet, Draxi said. The 50 troopers turned and marched in perfect unison up the ramp of the dropship. Vale hesitated for a fraction of a second, gave a crisp salute, and followed them into the dark interior. The massive engines of the dropship began to whine, a deafening buildup of anti-gravity displacement. The wind whipped up into a frenzy, tearing at the roof of the cabin, blowing a blinding cloud of snow and steam into the air. Draxi stood at the base of the ramp. She did not walk up it. Not yet. She turned around and walked back through the blinding steam. She stopped at the edge of the porch. Elias was still standing there. The crowbar was finally resting against the wooden deck. He didn't say thank you. Thank you was for holding a door open. You didn't say thank you to someone who just threw away their entire universe for you. They won't come back, Draxi said. Her voice was barely audible over the roar of the ship's engines. I filed the report under my own seal. The Dominion fears nothing but an unwinnable war. They will leave this system alone forever. Elias looked at her. He looked at the giant, terrifying, beautiful alien who had sat by his fire and eaten his stew. And what about you, Inishi? Elias asked. His voice was rough, scraping against his throat. Draxi looked at the dropship. If I stay, she said softly, they will eventually notice the discrepancy. They will send inquisitors. They will find this valley. They will find your cabin. They will burn it all to ash just to make an example of a traitor. She looked back at him. Her pale blue eyes were filled with a profound, quiet sorrow. It was the sorrow of a woman who had finally found a place to rest, only to realize that resting there would destroy it. I cannot stay, Elias. My duty was to the Empire. Now my duty is to keep them away from you. Elias knew about duty. He knew about the things a person had to do to protect the things they loved. He had carried the weight of a jammed barn door for 10 years. He recognized the heavy, agonizing burdens settling onto her shoulders. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't beg. That would only make the burden heavier. Elias reached out his left hand. Draxi looked at it. Then she reached out her right hand. The massive armored gauntlet gently enclosed his calloused, scarred fingers. There were no grand declarations. There were no tears. They were too old, both of them in their own ways, for the dramatic theatrics of youth. Their intimacy was built in the silence. It was built in the shared understanding of a harsh world and the quiet sacrifices required to survive it. She squeezed his hand just once, a pressure that promised she would remember the smell of wood smoke and the taste of black coffee for the rest of her unnaturally long life. Elias squeezed back, a promise that he would look at the stars differently until the day he died. Draxi let go. She turned and walked into the steam. She strode up the heavy metal ramp. She did not look back. If she looked back, she knew the commander would break and the woman underneath would refuse to leave. The ramp sealed shut. Elias stood on his porch. He watched the massive dropship lift off the ground, the force of the thrusters rattling his teeth. He watched it shoot upward, a dark spear piercing the bruised sky. He watched the massive armada hovering in the stratosphere slowly turn, engaging their faster-than-light drives. There were no flashes of light, no sound. 1 second, the sky was filled with nightmares, and the next there was only the piercing blue canvas of the Wyoming winter. Elias stood there for a long time. The wind began to blow again, clean and biting, sweeping away the chemical smell of the alien engines. He picked up his crowbar. He turned and walked back into the cabin. He shut the door. 1 year later, the winter had returned to the basin. The snow was deep, burying the lower pastures under 3 feet of unbroken white. The sky was the color of hammered lead. Elias stepped out onto the porch. He was 63 now. The lines around his eyes were a little deeper. He wore the same heavy canvas coat smelling of wood smoke and burlap. He carried his metal thermos in one hand and the iron crowbar in the other. He walked down the wooden steps. The crater in the yard had healed over the spring, covered by a tough, stubborn patch of wild prairie grass, now buried under the snow. He walked toward the fence line. The wind howled a bitter, biting gust that whipped across the frozen creek bed. Elias stopped. He braced himself, waiting for the familiar, agonizing tremor to seize his right hand. He waited for the ghost of the blizzard to wrap its freezing fingers around his wrist. The tremor did not come. His hand gripped the metal thermos tightly. It was steady. It was warm. He looked down at his knuckles. The skin was scarred, but it was whole. The phantom pain of a 10-year-old mistake had finally gone quiet. He took a deep breath of the freezing air, and for the first time in a decade, it did not taste like a graveyard. He walked to the edge of the property where the heavy steel wire separated his land from the wild forest. A massive pine branch had snapped under the weight of the snow during the night. It had fallen directly onto the fence line. Elias approached it. He set his thermos down on a snowbank. He prepared to spend the next 2 hours freezing his fingers off with bolt cutters and heavy staples. But as he got closer, he stopped. The pine branch was lying in the snow, but the heavy steel wire of the fence was not broken. Elias knelt down in the snowdrift. He brushed the powder away with his gloved hand. The thick gauge wire had been snapped by the falling tree. But where the break had occurred, the two ends of the metal were fused back together. The weld was flawless, smooth, emitting a very faint, almost imperceptible warmth that melted the snow an inch around it in a perfect circle. Elias stared at the flawless weld. He stood up slowly. He looked past the fence toward the cluster of wooden bee boxes sitting at the edge of the tree line. He walked over to the hives. The snow was piled high on their lids. He didn't open them. He knew the bees were asleep, sealed tight against the winter dreaming of the spring flowers. Elias knelt beside the center hive. He brushed the snow away from the heavy wooden baseboard. He reached his bare, steady hand underneath the wooden pallet. His fingers brushed against cold metal. He pulled it out. It was a small, metallic cylinder. No larger than a cigar, a localized plasma welder. Attached to the side of the cylinder was a tiny flat square of alien metal, a localized proximity sensor and power cell. An automated repair drone stripped down and jury-rigged with brilliant, terrible efficiency. It was designed to detect a breach in the perimeter, deploy the welder, fuse the metal, and return to its hiding spot beneath the wooden box. Elias held the alien technology in the palm of his hand. It was a weapon of war repurposed by a god of destruction, left behind to make sure an old man never had to freeze his hands fixing a broken fence ever again. Elias looked up at the gray sky. There were billions of stars hidden behind those clouds. Infinite worlds, infinite wars. He slid the tiny cylinder back under the wooden hive, hiding it securely from the world. He patted the top of the wooden box, a silent greeting to the sleeping golden insects inside. He picked up his thermos. He unscrewed the cap. The steam rose into the freezing air, smelling of dark roast and quiet mornings. Elias took a slow sip. He looked out over the unbroken snow of the Wyoming basin. He didn't feel alone anymore. He smiled, and he walked back home.